Hello everyone, thank you for making it out here on Friday at 4 p.m. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Schluessel. I actually printed out a paper but forgot to bring it, so pardon me, just reading off my phone. Eric Schluessel is Associate Professor of History and International Affairs and the Director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University. He's a social historian whose research focuses on 19th and 20th century Xinjiang, and his first book, Land of Strangers, the Civilizing Project in Central Asia, Qing Central Asia, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2020, uses local archival and manuscript sources in Chinese and Chaghatay Turkic to explore the ramifications of a project undertaken in the last decades of the Qing Empire to transform Xinjiang's Turkic-speaking Muslims into Chinese-speaking Confucians. It won the prestigious John K. Fairbank Prize from the American Historical Association in 2021. And thanks to grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies, Schluessel has also completed a translation and critical edition of the Tarikh-i Ḥamidi of Mullah Musa Sairami, which is an important Chaghatay language source for 19th century Xinjiang. It was published as the Tarikh-i Ḥamidi, a late Qing Uyghur history by Columbia University Press in 2023. And I might add that this is such an excellent translation that when I was on my parental leave in 2023, I could actually read it on my Kindle while holding a newborn and putting him to sleep. So for those of you who are interested, definitely recommend getting a copy. And he has also published a textbook in 2018 called An Introduction to Chaghatay, a graded textbook for reading Central Asian sources. It's available in print and also open access PDF format. And he's been offering courses in Chaghatay in Prague for the past few years and is widely regarded as a leading Chaghatay scholar. He's currently pursuing two research projects, of which we're going to see some of during this talk. Saints and Sojourners explores the economic history of the Uyghur region from the 1750s to the 1950s, as seen from below. And we are also going to be looking forward to Exiled Gods, which delves into Han Chinese settler culture and religion to illuminate the history of a diasporic community of demobilized soldiers and their descendants that span the Qing Empire. Dr. Schluessel, he received his Ph.D. in History and East Asian Languages at Harvard University in 2016. And he's taught at the University of Montana in Missoula and spent time at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In fact, I hope you don't mind me sharing, in fact, he'll be starting a new position at Oxford University as Associate Professor of Chinese and East Asian History this following January. So we're very lucky to catch him here in Houston before he makes that transatlantic journey. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Schluessel.
Thank you so much for being here. It is 4 on a Friday. Thank you to Jamin. Thanks to Drahan, the whole Transnational Asia team, for having me out and making the entire journey so very easy and so very pleasant. I'm so happy to see also a number of familiar faces in the room, more than I expected, in fact. So it's good to see folks. Thanks for having me in here for also the first time I've put all of these pieces into one talk. So let's see how it goes. This is basically a book project set in the late Qing and early Republican period in China, which is, as much of my work, focused on the region of Xinjiang, East Turkestan, Chinese Central Asia. A little bit of terminology first. I'll refer during the talk to the Musulmans. Musulman, literally meaning Muslim, was the typical way that people in this region who spoke Turkic languages and adhered to Islam referred to themselves during this period. It is roughly equivalent to, but not fully equivalent to, the modern term Uyghur or Uyghur. So the project that I'm talking about today is very much focused on this period in orange, from roughly the mid-19th century into the early 20th century. It's part of a broader attempt to write a grassroots economic history of this region during this period of critical change. This period of the late Qing early Republic is often cited by scholars, by Uyghurs themselves, as perhaps a colonial period, or at least a period where attitudes and identities began to shift very rapidly towards something like what we find familiar in the 20th century. We see this as a period not only of the emergence of something like an ethno-national identity that predominates over a religious identity, but also is one in which the socioeconomic conditions of the region transformed in really critical ways. That will be the title of this part of the book, but I'm finding so much material that eventually I want to take it into the era of collectivization. So what are we talking about? Now, this book really focuses on the action of what we might call merchant capital, that is, the actions of merchant networks that engage in trans-border trade or other kinds of arbitrage, and how that has affected what I might call the pious economy, which refers to the ways that production, circulation, and consumption were embedded in certain kinds of religious practices and ideologies, to borrow from Karl Polanyi and from Chris Hand, the economic anthropologist. This has a lot to do with a few places that are beyond Xinjiang's borders, in part in South Asia, in Hoshiarpur and Shikarpur, which I won't be able to talk about much today, unfortunately, but also critically, the city of Tianjin on the eastern coast of China. And these two places, as we'll find, are pretty intimately linked in ways that may surprise us. This is also one of the first economic histories of the region, which may surprise you. There have been economic histories of Xinjiang written before, but they tend to take the region as the unit of analysis. And in the Chinese case, they tend to be histories of how the British exploited Xinjiang from the outside, which is fair, they absolutely did. And they were pretty blunt about it in their internal records, too. Or histories of Soviet trade. There hasn't been a grassroots economic history that asks how ordinary agriculturalists, artisans, and merchants experienced the tumultuous changes that happened as the Eurasian economy came into new kinds of integration over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's what I'm really curious about. Now, why hasn't this happened? Well, because people have insisted since the late 19th century that there's no economy in Xinjiang, that it can't be studied, as it were. Ellsworth Huntington, the geographer, insisted upon his visits that there are no manufacturing communities in the region, no commercial centers, that all economy, all production and circulation is fundamentally local, and therefore primitive, unstudyable. Owen Lattimore, for all of his various virtues, basically reflected this attitude. As he looked at Xinjiang, what he saw was a ring of isolated oases, all of them entirely identical, like identical round pearls strung together on a string that only needed to engage in minimal trade. They're basically self-contained primitive societies. And other scholars have basically followed that lead. Even as we've discarded that idea of isolation and primitivity, it still really influences how we think about Xinjiang's past, to the point where Skinner, in his macro regions model and his model of marketing networks back in the 60s, completely excluded Xinjiang and Tibet from his analysis, claiming that, in fact, the region's economies were too primitive to analyze in terms of marketing networks. Now, again, Skinner's work's been problematized significantly, but it still deeply influences the way we think about Chinese history in terms of macro regions and marketing networks. And it means that for all of the revolutions we've had in the economic history of China, Xinjiang has been left out of the conversation in important ways. Similarly, while there's been a resurgence of economic history of Russian Central Asia, which relies on Russian sources, which are quite detailed, the Chinese sources are very different, and it's never quite gained a purchase methodologically in this region. So, what I'm going to say today is, and hopefully we'll get this done in 45 minutes to an hour, is that not only was there an economy in the region, obviously, because people produce and they exchange, but critical things happened to it during this period. Now, first of all, following the conflicts and wars of the mid-19th century, much of the region's economy had been plundered, in part by Hokkien soldiers who had occupied the region for more than a decade. But following that, following Xinjiang's reconquest and reabsorption into the Qing Empire, during the late Qing, when the region was made into a province, when it was under occupation by the Hunan army, this army was accompanied by Tianjinese merchants who influenced the local economy strongly. I would argue that they helped to disembed many economic practices from their Islamic context and reorient them towards not just merchant capital or networks of capital in Eurasia, but towards specifically Chinese forms of doing business. I argue that the main engine of change was land reclamation, or Kenhuang, which manifested as a merchant official I'll use the word collusion, to open up land and thus create a tax base and extract wealth and surplus from the region. Merchants took advantage of this to achieve what Jairus Banerjee would call the formal subsumption of labor to capital, following Marx in Capital. That is, the indirect influence of merchants and merchant interests on what people produce and where they produce it, but that in rather rapid order, merchants came to own land directly and thus directly influence what people who became sharecroppers were planting on their land, turning much of the region's economy towards an orientation towards the transregional market. One of the consequences of this was that even the most deeply embedded Islamic pious institutions, such as Waqf, pious endowments, began to shift their practices towards those learned from the now dominant Chinese merchant networks. Yes, this is very Marxist, but I have really good reasons for using this framework. Okay, when I speak about embeddedness then, what am I talking about? I was Richard about this last night. One of the reasons we haven't really studied the economic history of Xinjiang is that in both China and elsewhere, people have decided that sources in Islamic languages are not properly economic. This is actually a problem in the categorization of sources within China. The sources that we have demonstrate that actually production and circulation were deeply connected to piety. So here are two examples of risalas, or craft manuals. One from the risala of the weavers, and one from that of the merchants. And the weavers one demonstrates something interesting. When you get a manual for doing a craft in East Turkestan or across Central Asia, it is not a manual for how to do the craft, it is a manual for how to be a good Muslim by doing the craft. So here, for example, we have a series of questions and answers that will ask a weaver who has been inducted as a master into the guild, which verses of the Quran do you recite when you do certain actions during the day? And these verses will relate symbolically or more or less directly to the action themselves. They can sometimes serve as a way to time one's actions as one works the loom, for example. But the merchants, too, operated in important ways according to principles that we can think of as broadly Islamic or Islamicate. They figured themselves as the inheritors of Muhammad, who was himself a merchant, or put themselves into the identity of Alexander the Great, Dhul-Qarnayn, the Islamic prophet who traveled the world bringing Islam everywhere. Merchant activity was figured as a repetition of Muhammad and of Alexander. So to understand economy then, we have to understand that crafts were explicitly modeled off of not just piety, but specifically of Sufi lineages. On a broader scale, so here's a really cool document that I ran across in Sweden in 2011. It was in a cupboard for decades. This is a scroll collected by Lars-Erik Högberg, a Swedish missionary in Kashgar in the early 20th century, which records all of these pious endowments, waqf for al-Qaf, is the Arabic plural, as they were known in Kashgar circa 1900. Waqf is what you might call a totalizing institution. It is not just main property which exists to support an Islamic institution like a madrasa, or in the East Turkestani context, a tomb, shrine of a saint, but it's something which shapes the entire life around it, aesthetically, politically, economically, and religiously. These are important nodes in society. And part of what the scroll demonstrates is that these pious endowments held tremendous amounts of land. Up to, I'd say, about 10% of the arable land in the region appears to have been held by pious endowments. Therefore, one, we shouldn't be ignoring this part of the economy. And also, the scroll is only partial. We're missing a few pages of this, or might be even more. But also, it strikes me that these were major economic actors. They had to be. They held land that was as big as Cambridge, Massachusetts in one case, right? You had farmers working this land. Therefore, piety was not just a matter of ritual, it was an orientation for labor. These pious endowments survived by collecting rents, right? By collecting agrarian surplus as rent. And we can also see, here we go, a diagram in a little bit. You can see some of them were honestly just absolutely enormous. There's a real concentration of wealth around some of these. Not only were they big, they were widely distributed. So, the shrine of Apa Khoja, whom you may know as a major figure in Sufi history and the history of Xinjiang, held land in all of these places across an area dozens of kilometers wide. Now, this doesn't look like a primitive economy to us anymore, does it? This looks like an estate that is dispersed across a wide area, which manages large numbers of laborers who are basically bonded to the endowment, and thus must engage in some kind of activity to move that grain around, or at least if they're collecting the rents in cash, as sometimes they did, they must be putting it somewhere, right? So this is all implied to me that there must be networks here in the region. There must be networks of marketing, contrary to what Skinner said. Skinner at this point has been a straw man, sorry. But moreover, pious and economic activity was frequently co-located. Those guilds were figured as Sufi lineages with masters and disciples, and they in turn worshipped at the shrines of saints in certain places. And so, you would find that, for example, the shrine of Sultan Qlichatay has, for example, a cotton shop in Hanyara, and Hanyara was a major cotton producing center. And it held land in Hanyara, so somehow the shrine isn't just a place where weavers go to worship, it's also deeply bound together with growing and selling cotton. So this makes us very, very curious about these relationships between broadly belief and ritual and production circulation. And it turns out there are marketing networks. It's taken forever to map these out because there's no explicit guide to these, but mentions across Islamic, Chinese, and Western sources give us actually a picture of multiple networks of circulation around the region, which were especially well established in Kashgar and Yarkand, and don't seem to have changed very much since at least the mid-18th century. So here we have our permanent markets, and then places you can walk to in one day if you're a merchant. Ethnographic data suggests that ordinary farmers would visit one of these markets about once every 2 weeks. So actually people are quite strongly oriented towards the market. People are exchanging a lot more than we thought. Okay, so we've proven that Xinjiang had an economy, go us. That should have been obvious, but it's important to do the empirical work. Now we enter into the situation Tianjinese merchants. And here I've brought up the Tongshenhe, which is one of the 8 great houses of Tianjinese merchants who came to dominate Xinjiang's trade with the outside world and much of its internal trade. The Tianjinese merchants had come out of Yangliuqing, it's a town in Tianjin, and during a famine had joined themselves to the Hunan army, the Xiang army. This is an army which recovered much of Qing territory during the civil wars and ended up forming the major occupying force and governing body in Xinjiang until the end of the Qing period. And for their services, they were basically awarded monopolies, which persisted, interestingly, until the 1950s, when their businesses were nationalized. It was really surprising. They, over the course of decades, figured out how to navigate through outer Mongolia, through mountain passes and things, in order to avoid detection, even as their merchant enterprises became less and less profitable. In any case, they were useful, not just because they had access to markets of goods on the coast, but because they had access to credit markets, which were very helpful to the Xiang army, which desperately needed money in order to effect its reconquest and occupation. Historically, these groups have been thought of, they've been written down in a very heroic manner, often by descendants of these merchant households themselves. But as I suspect you'll realize, I'm not going to make heroes out of them exactly. I think that they actually had, they extracted a great deal of wealth from the region through their collusion with the government. And the primary engine of that was land reclamation. Right, so we're going to return to Kucha a couple of times here. This is a region on the northern rim of the Tarikh Basin, which has been home since the 14th century to the Qataki Hojas. You can see Qataki estate up there, who had converted Tughlaq Timur Khan, the Chaghatay ruler, to Islam, and had thus been granted pious estates in Ich Iraq, Inner Ditch, and Yak Iraq, Outer Ditch, and had held them for centuries. They had actually been major leaders in the uprisings and wars of the 1860s, 1870s, but had quickly ingratiated themselves with the Qing once again, made themselves out to be loyal subjects. So those areas to the south were made into areas of land reclamation in Kuchar, because Qing officials believed that Kuchar was underinhabited. Unlike Kashgar, which actually couldn't feed itself and had to import food, Kuchar, they said, had maybe a third, maybe even just only a sixth of the population it could support if only we could irrigate more of the land. And so they turned to what we call a crop lien system. Merchants, as many of us study 19th century Chinese history know, have become increasingly powerful as intermediaries across the entire empire. They could manage things that government could not, in terms of logistics, information gathering, and of course the movement of money. So, the way that the Xiang army officials who now controlled Xinjiang saw it, they would lend silver to the Tianjin's merchants. The Tianjin's merchants would then lend copper coins, in a bimetallic system here, to ordinary farmers, who would then purchase the right to use lands, get their zhizhao, right, get their certificate allowing them to reclaim the land, and then over time, the farmers would pay back their debts to the merchants would pay back the government, and the government would get taxes once the land was opened up. How do you think this worked out? Yeah, badly. Typically, the merchants said, well, we haven't got, no one can pay our debts, and so they never repaid the governments. Instead, for the most part, newly reclaimed lands was not actually that viable across Xinjiang, which is one of the reasons why, well, as a consequence of this, people tended to farm land for a few years, and then they were often dispossessed of it. They left it behind, but their debts traveled with them. And the merchants continued to pursue those debts. This includes not only Chinese, but also South Asian merchants, by the way. Nevertheless, it briefly led to an expansion of economic activity in places like Fujian. Here's Musa Sairami, the chronicler, writing in 1903 about how the effort to reclaim lands by irrigating it and opening up new farming in Fujian had led to in-migration. And it did, not only of Han settlers and Hui settlers, some of whom were being resettled after displacement, but also the Muslims or Uyghurs, who were purchasing land as well. He says, the houses of commerce are flourishing. Sairami had been a tax collector. The man knew money, he knew economy. And his evaluation of this project was initially very positive. And indeed, what we see in Fujian is that the network of marketing centers outlined here, as I identified in 1880, through the process of land reclamation, through the opening up of new land and thus new needs for markets, and the increasing orientation of that agrarian production towards the markets, had expanded the system of marketing networks as well. We can actually watch it happen in real time in Fujian because we know when the markets were established. This is partly an intentional effort on the part of Qing officials, and parallel processes took place in Hotan, where similar experiments were done. Sairami, writing 5 years later, reports that in fact land reclamation had led to ecological disaster rather quickly. He writes, people have abandoned the lands and they've fled in every direction. Their farms, houses, orchards, and property have fallen into ruin. And Sairami's observations are confirmed not only by Western travelers like R.L. Stein, who paid close attention to land usage and water usage, but actually, they're attested to, I'll get this one first, attested to by later Qing, actually post-Qing officials, who discovered that during the last years of the Qing, officials had been overusing land, in part in order to gain revenue for themselves. They had been overexploiting land and opening up areas along rivers that had been intentionally kept unused for generations. You see, in Xinjiang, any given water system was typically controlled by a mirab, literally a prince of water, a locally elected figure who would manage water use along, say, an entire river or an irrigation channel. It's a very arid region, so these sorts of institutions were important. And below the mirab were kukbishis, waterheads, blueheads, who knew how to lay out the irrigation channels, like human theodolites. They could see the distance and measure how best to lay out the irrigation channel. This sort of long-distance coordination between communities and villages had broken down under late Qing rule, as watersheds were divided between counties. And those counties then took direct responsibility for those resources, but the counties were led by officials who didn't know much about the local situation and who were in desperate need of money. And so frequently, they sold off land that they shouldn't have sold off, or they fell victim to their own local interlocutors who took advantage of this situation to open up land that they probably also shouldn't have. So in the case of the Kashgar River crisis, it was found that, okay, the Kashgar River, you have Kashgar upstream, it gets 3 out of 6 parts of the water flow of the Kashgar River. Downstream, you have Faizabad, which gets 2 parts. Then further down, Maralbashi gets 1 part. And some fool in Faizabad, had been opening up more and more land, leading to the problem where folks in Maralbashi could not grow their crops anymore. And this is happening actually everywhere by the 1910s, happening in Turfan, Kuchar, Khotan, Kashgar, pretty much anywhere there have been long-standing water use. Doesn't matter. This also led famously to violence, by the way. The vast majority of violent crimes and murders recorded from late Xinjiang involve debtors beating their creditors to death. So in this case, we have Xie Shaochun, that's right, who's a member of one of these Tianjin merchant houses. He'd engaged in a practice of advance purchase of cotton, which is effectively a way of lending someone money legally at very high interest. And his debtors had been unable to pay it off by getting all the cotton he wanted, so they snuck into his house and night and killed him. So, okay, clearly, something is up. Clearly, we have a situation where merchants who are closely allied with the government have used their own influence, access to information, access to credit, to try and extract wealth from this region by shaping its production towards market goods, such as cotton, things they could sell elsewhere. And in doing so, they managed to cast many local agriculturalists into debt. So far, this is all anecdotal, right? I mean, all the anecdotes speak pretty clearly of environmental degradation, debt, all these things that we think of as being basically bad. There's an issue in the history of Xinjiang, which is that a lot of our work is anecdotal. Actually, a lot of our work in contemporary Xinjiang is very anecdotal as well. A lot of it relies on Marxist approaches to enclosure and extraction, which make a lot of sense anecdotally, but we never really have a quantitative basis to test what we're saying. Well, I'm a fool, so I started to create a quantitative basis to test whether or not merchant influence in the late Qing early Republic had the effects that I'm seeing in the anecdotes. So fortunately, Turfan has a published archive. And in fact, I have both archives published from 1877 through 1911, and also some documents from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region archive, which all speak to land usage and land registration. In fact, from 1878, we have a full cadastre produced of Turpan by the Qing authorities. I have turned this into a spreadsheet of over 6,800 entries. This quixotic effort has really paid off. Now, okay, but first, anyone who works in the Qing, you're going to say, how do you know that these records are in any way reliable, right? Because famously, Ming Qing cadastres and land surveys are problematic. They're often out of date, they're not updated, and as we know, in places like Guangdong, people hid their land from the government all the time. Okay, how do we know? One way is by reconstructing the patterns of landholding that are reflected on the cadastres themselves. We can actually see that our test cases conform very closely to modes of landholding that are attested ethnographically. So in this case, you see Gaine and Arshernai up there. Their plots are kind of interleaved. This is a common result of inheritance in Turfan. So I don't think that this is a lie. I think that this is an accurate reflection of what was happening. Moreover, we actually have a lot of records of how they went about recording land at the local level, thanks in part to this pile of notebooks that we found in the basement of the State Library of Berlin, which record actually poverty relief and famine relief at the village level. And they have inserts that attest to how people sought out and checked information about land and land usage and about the expected income from land in grain. By the way, I love this source because even though it's in Chaghatay, and its overall form conforms to the kind of thing you find at Persian chancery from like Khiva. It's written on Chinese paper with a Chinese brush, which is why the handwriting is terrible. It has little circles, which you recognize from Chinese accounting, and much of the terminology is actually directly transliterated from Chinese, not to mention it uses Suzhou numerals. So this is a Qing document in late Qing Chaghatay. They're really fun. Moreover, there are actually accounts in the archives of people finding out that there's something wrong with a survey, and then forcing people to go about go back and check the survey again. So actually, officials in late Xinjiang seem to have been very careful about who owned what land where. And they update the records quite frequently. We can also see marks on them. I wonder if we can see it here. But there are lots of annotations on the cadastres themselves that show where they were later updated, where notes were made. It's not very clear here, but there's a stamp up there indicating a change in land status. And you'll see a few more notes later on. Anyway, sorry, I'm nerding out about the documents. I should be talking about the argument. Okay, so what can we actually do with this data? We start asking questions about who actually owned land, because we should expect that over the course of the Qing Early Republic, we would see a transfer of land out of the hands of local people, Muslims, Uyghurs, into outsiders. And if there's quantitative evidence for that, then that is evidence. If not, we should rethink our argument. So here's a general picture of just the top 500 landholders in Turfan, excluding the Junwang, the king of Turfan, who had a vast estate. Actually, you find the largest landholder is Gongzhong, meaning it was part of the Khans, actually. So a lot of the estate land was balanced by commons. And what you find is that as of 1878, the vast majority of people with any sort of wealth or land in this region were Muslim, they were Uyghur. It was a very Uyghur-dominated economy. You get occasional individuals like Wang Fulu, Guofu, people like this, but they're not really big landholders yet. What is this? But if we go to 1895, sorry, we're covering up the date here. There we go. So that was 1878. This is 1895. We can actually start to see changes. And sorry, I've switched from mu to hectares. I ran late into the slides. But the point is, by 1895, in our tax censuses, we actually start to see clearly Chinese names and terms appear as major landholders. This one, Fu Shun Tai, really caught my eye. I wasn't thinking as I typed it in, who or what is Fu Shun Tai? But it turns out that this is a Cantonese merchant household, merchant group. Okay. So let's also think about landholding patterns in the region. Because actually one thing I found is that there are two distinct patterns of landholding in this period. What we see here are the registrations of the landholding households according to their ethnicity. And the vast majority, as you can see, are Muslim or Uyghur, pretty much everywhere. There are a couple places where we see a large number of Hui, Sino-Muslims, because they were settled there by the Qing following the Muslim uprisings. So Zongtang had resettled Muslims in Han in a segregated fashion in Gansu. We did the same thing in this region, apparently. Then we have Liangzhou and Yulin, both of which were sites of Han settlements. Afterwards, many demobilized soldiers were placed there. So actually we see an ethnically segregated sort of system of landholding with lots of households in the old settlements to the east and small numbers of households over here to the west. In contrast, however, we'll note that the average parcel size in these areas with lower population is actually much, much bigger, whereas average parcel size in the older settlements is much smaller. Moreover, let's see. We should also note a few other important details here. So in places where we've had settlements by Hui and Han, the amount of land by ethnicity seems to track, at least at first, roughly with the number of households from that group. So we're not really seeing any clear dominance by an ethnic group here, anything like that. If anything, what we're seeing is continued dominance by wealthy people of various groups, but especially by wealthy Muslims and aristocrats. The aristocratic land is especially reflected in places like Lukchen, which have major estates held by the Junwang up through this period. So, in old settlements then, we have what we might call minifundia. Here I'm borrowing from Bruno Alfani and his work in early modern Italy, but also from the study of Latin American landholding patterns, which makes total sense. In places like Astana, Shurya, Sengen, we'll look at Astana in a second, there were small parcels of land that had been held by a family, possibly for decades, and that had been divided up many times through inheritance, and that were largely classified as 供养地目, or tribute land. That is to say that the tax or rent from them was collected by the king of Turpan, the remaining aristocrats in the Turpan Basin. They also therefore show a lower per capita tax quota, because by and large people had smaller landholdings. In these areas we see the expansion of land through land reclamation to some degree, but primarily I'm finding that it's existing owners of land who are claiming new land under the land reclamation areas. So wealthy Muslims primarily were benefiting from land reclamation in these older settlements. And Chinese merchants to some degree purchase land, but it's not the dominant way that land is expanding. That said, the Xiang Army administration, in its efforts to turn Xinjiang into a normal province and not a kind of inner Asian territory, was desperately trying to convert aristocratic land under the Turfan king into normal taxed land under the direct control of the local administration. So here we have, I apologize for the low quality of the diagrams, not that good at this yet. I'm just learning quantitative methods now, really. So if you see a little comparison of Astana between 1876 and 1895, it's an entirely Muslim-dominated economy with a relatively small amount of overall wealth, about 313.8075 dan would be collected in tax on an annual basis. By 1895, we actually find that nearly 200 dan of tax more is expected from this area, but the number of overall households has decreased from 521 to about just under 420 households, which suggests a concentration of land in fewer hands, even as the quality and amount of land has increased. And we're starting to see Han landowners come into the picture. Only about 7 registered Han households, several of which are actually merchant houses, not families. And they're beginning to own a larger overall proportion of that land. So maybe our hypothesis about merchant dominance is correct. We can see it here. So here's the top 100 households in Astana by the amount that they owned. Actually, the top owner is the so-called Dagongbeizi, or the big gumbaz, the big mazar or shrine in the area. And we don't really see any Han names here. But by 1895, we see a number of new groups. Here's a Fushuntai. Here's that Tianjinese merchant house. And here's their closely related Tianshuntai merchant house, which now has entered the top landowners. A Hui named Ma Si has begun to buy up land. His name means Ma number 4. He has brothers, Ma San, Ma Ar, etc. Ma number 2, Ma number 3, who are also buying land in the area. And what we seem to see is one wealthy Hui family actually buying plots not just in Astana, but across the entire region. So I do think that we're seeing the gradual accumulation of larger and larger plots of land in the hands of single households or merchant groups. How are they doing it? Oh, and by the way, all of these, with perfectly equal amounts of land, those are aristocratic estates being managed on behalf of the king of Turfan. So how do they do it? Through sharecropping. So these merchant groups, which managed to indebt farmers to them, then began to approach them and offer to purchase the land in exchange for them giving them half of their produce per year. It's something we might call partner planting, which sounds very nice when you put it that way. But it seems quite clear that the Fushuntai and other groups, by the end of the Qing period, had accumulated large amounts of agricultural lands with farmers who were no longer indebted to them, but rather were working for them directly and paying them rent. So whereas the WAC were extracting agrarian surplus through rents, now these merchant groups have done it through debts and also a kind of rental system like this as well. Okay. At the same time, that's in the smaller settlements like Austin, the older settlements like Austin now, smaller minifundia, smaller farms. In the new settlements, we find latifundia. These are the areas of resettlements where Hui and Han and displaced Muslims were placed after the war. These are often referred to, by the way, as gong, and gong is a really funny term. It means work. I was talking to Jamin about this earlier. The legend is that the first gong in Xinjiang is named after a Vietnamese aristocrat who was resettled there. It's a weird story, but we'll figure out. The point is, in the late Qing, Gong expanded all across unfarmed areas as sites of settlement, sometimes of forced marriage and resettlement for displaced women, where individual households registered very large new landholdings, usually 1 or 2 vast parcels, which were categorized immediately as official lands, being under the direct control of the local administration. This, by the way, closely resembles land reclamation in Qinghai and in Heilongjiang, the northeast of China during the same period. This also allowed, however, for merchants to purchase large amounts of land directly. We see lots of signs of this in the archive. So here's one of those notes from the cadaster, which indicates that 5 merchant houses, including the Guangshuntai, one of the Shuntai merchant houses, has purchased all of the settlement called Xiangong. Now the Guangshuntai, much like the Fushuntai, had been known as moneylenders early on. They were based mainly in Astana, where they purchased that smaller amount of land. Xiangong is located just to the west of Astana. And it appears that, while this was initially a mixed settlement with mainly Muslims or Uyghurs farming it, by the early 1880s, all of the land was simply purchased directly by these merchants. The later tax indices reflect that as well. Okay, so what are the consequences of this? We've talked about the Qatakees. Now, the Qatakees were important local notables with an 800-year-long history, tremendously authoritative Sufi leaders in their region. Around 1916, they began to panic. And you can see why. Because not only was land reclamation bringing settlers down to the lower reaches of the rivers, but an official from Turpan, Abdul Qadir Haji, or Hadar in the Chinese record, he was an Uyghur or Muslim military officer who had gained the special trust of Yang Zengxin, the first Republican-era governor of Xinjiang. And Governor Yang saw Abdul Qadir Haji as this guy who could get anything done. If you needed revenue, you get it done. Even at this point, when they're beginning to realize that land reclamation is leading to ecological degradation, land reclamation remained the primary way that the Xinjiang provincial government gained revenue all the way into the late 1920s. And Abdul Qadir Haji was very happy to help. He partnered with a very curious figure named Ai Xueshu, or Tayyip Imin. He was an Uyghur, a Muslim who had been Confucianized in the late Qing period and eventually became a magistrate himself. So these two, Uyghurs, Muslims who were close to the government, came down from Turban into Kuchar, which is not too far away. They began to exploit land here, the headwaters of the rivers. Abdul Qadir Haji wanted to found his own new town in this area. He briefly did. He opened up this area, right where the river comes out of the mountains, for agricultural exploitation. Now, what do you think that led to? I mean, obviously, people downriver began to lose their land. It's been happening already since the early 1900s. Stein had observed how people in the lower reaches of these rivers were abandoning their farms. They were trying to engage in pastoralism instead, but many of them had simply fled their farms and entered the regional labor market. I've been tracking, by the way, the movement of these dispossessed people, and they mainly tried to go to the Ili Valley, where you could get 8 times the wages for the same kind of work as you could down in a place like Kuchar. So this began to affect the Waqf. It began to affect their pious endowments, which again were collecting surplus through rents according to Islamic law, even as merchants were beginning to collect even more of that surplus through debts across the region. By 1916, they realized that their land was drying up. So, to make a long story short, this family broke into 3 factions. There's a conservative faction who said we must hold to Islamic law properly. We shall not charge interest. We shall not sell off the endowment land. There's another faction which was conservative but wanted to gain control of it. And actually, testimony from a member of that faction will prove very enlightening in the story I'm about to tell. But there's a third faction, led by one of the nephews of the former rebel, Rashiduddin. And he decided with his uncle to try and turn the Waqf into a business. But first, they sold off some of the land, which was no longer productive. They also tried to get their farmers to submit their rents not in kind, not in grain, but in silver. in part because, as the mid-1910s, they were dealing with also the fluctuation of currency due to the chaos in Russia and things like this. But all these measures weren't working, and so they got what they refer to as Benjin, from Chinese Benjin, that's this word, startup capital, right? This initial investment in order to create their own merchant network. They set up a shop, one in Ili to the northwest, one in Kashgar, and one down to the south in the town of Toibolde, which the government had been opening up. Governor Yang was encouraging people to settle this area, not only to encourage the growth of the tax base, but to enable transition across a planned highway across the Taklamakan Desert to Hotan. So the Catechees opened their shop and expanded their network, and it didn't go very well, in part because they weren't very good at this whole merchant business, but also didn't have the connections that the Tianjinese had or other merchants had to markets elsewhere. They were trying to be a Chinese merchant network, as it were. This led at some point to a conflict. Now, in the Chinese historiography, what happened in 1918 is remembered as the Bai Uprising, when the Catechi Hojas, as Islamist separatists, attempted to wrest Xinjiang away from the embrace of the motherland. In fact, that is how Governor Yang construed the incident that was to follow, in part because this is very useful for his own narrative politically about how he was defending the borderlands and the sovereignty of China. What actually seems to have happened is that there is a dispute between the Catechi Waqf capitalists, as it were, and their Chinese competitors. And one night, Abdul Qadir Haji and a posse of mixed Chinese merchants and his own militia surrounded the shop at Toibolde and opened fire. Muhammad bin Hoja and his followers managed to flee northward and up into the mountains, where eventually he was hunted down and his head was brought back. And he was branded a rebel. And then control over the pious endowment reverted to the conservative faction, who then maintained it according to Islamic law. The Chinese accused the British of orchestrating the entire thing. The British had no idea what was going on. They were deeply confused. What had happened was that Naim Beg, this slippery local figure who also went by Lin Shengqian, or sometimes Ram, he could be Hindu one day, away another, Muslim another, had been selling British trading licenses to Chinese merchants and now to the Catechi Waqf capitalists. These trading licenses allowed them to avoid taxation because of the treaties with the British. So the Han and other Muslim traders had been successfully avoiding taxation. And when the Catechees attempted to do the same thing, this became evidence of their supposed support by foreign forces and their attempt to collude against the government. To me, this incident dramatizes a failed attempt by members of the old order, managers of a pious endowment, to adapt to the new system. And this isn't the only data point, actually. There are quite a number of instances where individuals who are part of the old order of things adapted to the new system. I don't have a slide for this, but the famous Tash al-Hum. Tash al-Hum, actually the uncle of Sayyidina Azizi, one of the most long-lived figures in modern communist history, had been a member of an old Hoja Sufi family in Yarkand, which had existed for centuries. And he used the land that his ancestors had purchased in the 1500s to found a new factory in Yarkand, using Armenian expertise, among other things. And he was very successful in this regard. Others were much more successful because they managed to work directly with the government and gain the patronage of Governor Yang. One of them was actually Aisrishu himself, who after returning from, who during this period actually, took a parcel of land he'd received as a student from the Turkmen government and turned it into a textile mill in Turkmen. He was later accused of not paying his workers, and he managed to die without fully fulfilling their wages. But the point is, okay, all of these local actors had somehow adapted to the new order, as it were, both between the way that Chinese merchants went about their business in terms of production and consumption and circulation, but also they adapted to the ways that Chinese merchants had learned to work with the governments for mutual benefit. Consequently, this is sort of the story I'm trying to tell in the book, is that at one point, Chinese merchant capital came to shape production, circulation, and consumption across Xinjiang's agrarian economy. They had a bigger influence on this than we tend to realize. Now, why is this? Because we don't actually see it very clearly in the archive itself. Wealthy people are good at staying out of the archives. They don't tend to get into trouble. But if we pay close attention to the quantitative data, we actually see this drama play out both in the numbers and in the margins. We see first an indirect domination of land and how it's used, formal subsumption of labor capital. And then we start to see the direct control of lands through the purchase of large areas of reclaimed land. The way that they did it led to the impoverishment of farmers. Actually, this is one of the puzzles I've been trying to solve, is why is Xinjiang poor? It's noticeably poorer than its neighboring regions during this period, poorer than Fergana, poorer than Ili, poorer even than North India. There must be some reason why it does so badly in this period. I think part of it is Chinese merchants and South Asian merchants, the way that they indebted people. That's the other thing I was going to talk about, sorry. The other part of it is that the region has been integrated into the Eurasian economy in ways that reflect what happened in India, with the displacement of the native weaving industry in favor of foreign manufacturers. So I mean, I might be painting a somewhat negative or cynical picture of the way that Musliman or Uyghur actors tried to adapt to the new system, but I think in some ways they were also trying to bring industry back to their region to push back against the way that British and Chinese manufacturers and Russian manufacturers were actually undermining local industry. So, over time, this led to environmental degradation as it undermines long-standing systems of water management, and it also forced members of the old order, of the pious estates and others, to change their practices as agriculturalists and also artisans were displaced from or disembedded from their normal economic behaviors and sent into a regional labor market. This is kind of a classic story of capitalism and enclosure, which is why I've adopted such a stridently Marxist perspective on it. But I've also endeavored to make sure that that perspective and that theory is supported by clear quantitative and anecdotal data. So, since I like to make this book, I can't wait for your questions and comments, and I really appreciate your patience as I walk through this whole thing. Thanks again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Oh, might there be? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, do you want to take questions from the audience? Do you want to handle that by yourself, or?
I'd be very happy to. How shall I deal with the
So I'm going to
questions?
just so here we're going to see no open questions actually.
Okay, so you got the thing?
Yeah.
Great.
And none on this end actually.
So hi. Yes, please.
Wow. That's crazy research. It is chaotic and chaotic in a very exciting way. So you only briefly at the end referenced the influences and the manipulations of the British, especially British in India, Indian merchants too, of course, must have been in the area. In what ways are they able to play a role? Is it just individual merchants, or is there a governmental influence? I'm also looking at your original map, which is showing the Russians right there, the British India right there. Surely there is some conflict. Those borders are deeply porous.
Mm-hmm.
How are they impacting? You mentioned British taxes. Yeah. This is a messy part of the world, and you have not cleared it up.
Oh gosh, sorry.
No, I mean that in a good way.
Well, I guess that's part of it. I mean, it is chaotic, and that's part of the fun of doing this research. Okay, so the South Asian presence was here in the southern part of the Tarim Basin since at least the 18th century, certainly earlier according to Scott Levi's research, right? Very much present to the point where there were multi-generational households of mixed South Asian and local Muslim families. And it was not uncommon to find Hindus who would be Hindu on one side of the Pamirs and Muslims on the other side of the Pamirs, maintaining their own properties and their own families in this area. And this is very well documented in the India Office records because so many disputes emerged over subjecthood and citizenship, and also the question in the 1890s of whether or not Chinese subjects had taken Indian subjects as slaves, right, who had to be manumitted. If you look at the office records, the British are constantly concerned about how Shikarpuri and Multani merchants, especially, are engaged in money lending. So quite frequently, it leads to not only multiple riots against the Hindus in the area, which had to be resolved by sort of multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalitions. It leads to acts of enslavement of local women, especially when debts can't be paid. It's a point of real concern for the British, less so for the Chinese, I've found. And I think I know why. It's because actually, as much as the Hindu moneylenders were influential in the area and very visible, they were highly concentrated in Kahalak, which is a town east of Yarkand. And the vast majority of them didn't really leave that area except for periodical sojourns in the rest of the Tarim Basin. They operate under the Shah-Guzashta system, the principal and agent system, familiar from much of South Asia, as I understand it, following markets and Rizvi and all that. And so they were largely tied to merchant families established in North India, about whom I have almost no information, unfortunately, who were very intentionally sending people out to gather debts. They took advantage of their treaty status and the British, obviously. Shoot, where was I going with this? Oh, yes. And then, at least initially, the British had really thought of them as a positive force because they were a vanguard of expansion. However, by the 1890s, once the British were actually into the region, they'd kind of given up on trying to establish hegemony there, and they turned into a problem instead. So, have I answered the question?
Yeah.
Kind of a little bit. The thing is, I think they're less influential than we assumed they were. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the part that is so surprising, I guess.
I thought so too. I mean, they operate very much like the Chinese merchants, but their actual geographical scope is much smaller. Please.
Yes, it's amazing study that I cannot imagine how hard you got those documents and dig those documents from Xinjiang archive. I do some archive work, I know how hard it is. But my question here is, you show a map that connects Xinjiang with Tianjin, that Tianjin merchants go through all the way to Russia, Mongolia, and Russia, arrive in Xinjiang. I'm just curious that since the route they went through, they went to here show go to Datong or somewhere.
Yeah.
I cannot say clear. And from Tianjin to towards west a little bit, and then go further. And I'm just curious that what kind, because in the Qing time, Shanxi merchant and the bankers play a very important role in the trade in the north part of China, as well as that region, Russia, Mongolia, that region, that if Tianjin merchant will go through about the same route, then what happened to those Shanxi merchants? They would find about the same opportunity of commercial opportunity. So that is my first question. The second question is that so far you have been talking about simply just try to say that what merchant, the merchant from some place and have been purchasing or occupied land in Xinjiang. I'm curious that since they have a good connection between Tianjin and Xinjiang, what kind of a commodity a movement between this region that will create a local market? Okay, thank you.
Excellent questions, thank you. So the first one, the Shanxi merchants. I mean, before 1864, Shanxi merchants were definitely dominant in this area. Very clearly, which makes a lot of sense given the positioning. George Qiao Zhijian is writing actually a book on the early, okay, so you know about this, yeah. He's like on the early ways that Shanxi merchants' merchant practices actually evolved through the Xinjiang trade. So it's absolutely the case. What's interesting in the late Qing is that they were displaced from that position of dominance so very sharply. I do find this strange as well. Shanxi merchant houses persisted at a lower level, and they still engaged in certain kinds of trade, mostly up the Heshi corridor and into Turpan, through Barco, Balikun, places like this. But they were no longer the dominant force. So they were trading cloth, certainly, tobacco, goods like these. But it was the Tianjin merchants who were able to move large amounts of money. The Tianjinese were also moving goods for the Han Chinese settler population, such as actually early on vinegar, soy sauce, costumes for performing Chinese opera. All these things were being transported from Guihua over to Gucheng, where they had warehouses. And that was actually sort of the merchant center of northern Xinjiang, that area. I think that they were able to outcompete the Shanxi merchants because they had the backing of the Xiang army and very close political connections, is what it comes down to. So no, other merchants were still present, but in much less proportion and with much less wealth. As for the interaction of them out in Outer Mongolia, I find that really interesting too. There are a number of accounts, both in the Wenshi Ziliao and by Owen Lattimore and folks like this, about the journey from Guihua to Wucheng. And they never really talk about other merchant groups. It seems like, according to Lattimore and others, they found sort of their own secret route at some point through Outer Mongolia that they managed to maintain for themselves, and maybe through escorts or maybe threat of violence, they also maintained a kind of monopoly over their routes. But you're completely right. I mean, definitely years of tradition, things like this, Cai Weijia's work, Shanxi merchants were profoundly influential in Outer Mongolia. And they also engaged in this kind of money lending activity. I guess the difference there is that the Shanxi merchants went directly north. The Tianjin merchants kind of got through Mongolia as quickly as possible. Yeah, and they didn't stop, right? So it's a very, very strange sort of long distance trade. Did I answer the second question?
The second question is about what kind of commodity, you mentioned the commodity movement between Tianjin. You mentioned some.
There we go. No, cotton is really the big one. Cotton's the big one.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, one note that the frustrating thing is the Tianjin archives have almost nothing on this, which is very frustrating because clearly this is an entangled history of two places, but the Tianjin archives have almost not a single mention of the Xinjiang trade, even though it's well attested across other kinds of documents and sources.
Some of my study involved northern Shanxi and Gansu, Ningxia, and that region, and that up to 1920s, 30s, there are still a large number of young farmer or they do not have landless peasants that they go to the travel along with those merchants to Mongolia. That was also, and only after communists took over that region, and so that kind of activity, because of the border region was blocked by a nationalist government, and then that kind of activity stopped.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot of sense. Yeah. I'd love to hear more sometime. Can we talk afterwards? So I actually think those sorts of histories displaced in the Northwest are really important and so understood. So I'd love to know more.
Could we get a question from the
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read it out loud. It's from Stephen Wayne Lewis. Thank you for the fascinating presentation and also wonderful conversation yesterday. I have a question only an annoying China energy policy person could ask. Do you happen to know how these traditional forms of property rights over land, religion-based, ethnic-based, sub-ethnic-based, have survived into the PRC era, especially with the PLA oil exploration units and the creation of the Xinjiang oil field administrations. I can see in various histories of these since the 1960s that these state-owned enterprises contain within them a myriad variety of traditional property rights forms, including collectives and cooperatives, and especially for Uyghur workers and residents in their oil field territory. And I can't help but wonder if these might be remnants of the forms of property you're talking about in your presentation today. Anyway, curious for your thoughts on this.
Direct, Steve, towards Ildiko Bellerhan's work. There's a book called The Great Dispossession that she and Chris Hahn put together based on fieldwork in Kumul, or Hami, which talks about the effects of collectivization on Uyghur agriculture, including through the 1980s and 1990s. Their argument is that collectivization produced a sort of new kind of feudalism, almost, that it actually took a heavily market-oriented agricultural economy and oriented towards production for the state, which limited people's movements and really disrupted traditional ways of property holding. I tend to agree with what they're saying, especially Guldana Salamjan, also speaking of the Kazakh case, points out how waves of enclosure since the 1950s have dispossessed Kazakh herders from their land. So I think that there's been real damage there. That said, this is really resilient stuff. One of the reasons I enjoy studying WACF is because it produces kind of a counter-archive in some ways to what's happening in the Chinese archives. So here we have, for example, a document related to WACF from the settling accounts movements in 1950, in which a manager of a pious endowment is accused of being a spy for the nationalists. And what's the solution? They're not eliminating the WACF. They're replacing the head of the pious endowments, right? So these things actually survive into the 50s, and they're only really eliminated with collectivization. Even then, I have been told, and again, this is anecdotal, unfortunately, not quantitative, but I'm told that land that was previously reserved for pious endowments, people traditionally avoid farming on it today in order to preserve the sacredness of that. This in part because pious endowments are often associated with a very visible tomb shrine or other religious site which is on the landscape. And the holiness of it is marked out by terrain, might be elevated by trees planted on it, etc. So there seems to be a persistent memory of that. As for general practices of inheritance, first, I wouldn't say that these were particularly traditional in any sense. They really just conform very perfectly to Hanafi jurisprudence in Islam. I've never found any particular evidence in the Turkestani case that there's any kind of inheritance that wasn't just laid out in the Hanafi jurisprudence. And so in that sense, Qing and then Chinese authorities have been pushing back against that since the 1870s. And I don't suspect that that has really survived past 1949. But the jury's out. I haven't seen evidence either way. Great question from Steve. Oh, hi, yes, Sydney.
Thank you for this really wonderful talk. I learned a lot myself. I'll see some parallels in my research on Japanese settler colonialism, which we can talk a little bit later. But my question is the property rights during that time. So I was wondering, because your research is from the late Qing to the early Republic era. So I was wondering how this settler colonial dispossession was justified. In what way they were justified. I mean, I know, the Han Chinese settlers, they were backed up by the military, right? This army and their successors. But how, legally they were justified, and whether this justification during the late Qing were carried on in the Republic era.
So let's think ideologically first about the roots of Zuozong Tang and the Qingshi community, which designed the reconstruction of the Northwest. As Hannah Faker demonstrates, I think, pretty well in her dissertation on Shanxi and Gansu after the Muslim uprisings. As I think I say about this a little bit in Land of Strangers, there was a belief that Hui people, Muslims especially, had to be separated and isolated in order to be civilized. And so part of this, or the resettlement you see in places like the Gongs, is motivated by a decades-old belief that Muslims in China are nearly civilized, but not quite. That the Hui especially are dangerous, and that the Muslimans of this region are actually quite educable. Beyond that, This entire process operated within the framework of the Qing legal system. So there's no need to justify it. There's no great story about how we're taking this land and making it better. Peter Lavelle's written a bit about that in the case of the attempts to introduce non-native plants and animals to make Xinjiang more like China proper. But the ideology that the ruling party brought to Xinjiang didn't have actually that much impact on the ground because the state didn't have that much capacity. So this is taking place within the legal system. There aren't even disputes about most of this because these were routine land purchases. Yeah. I mean, and retrospectively, I've never seen some grand ideological statement trying to justify this.
And then the Republic era
Yeah.
basically was the same.
I would say so, yes. I mean, in the case of the Republican era, it's the same rhetoric as the late Qing. Opening up lands is an economically positive activity. It is the only way of establishing autarky and sort of independence in Xinjiang, which was one of the main goals of late Qing Republican governments. Yang Songqing especially cast himself as a kind of Taoist ruler who wanted to create an ideal society in the borderlands. And one of the reasons why land reclamation was pursued so fervently was because the underlying belief that land is basically inexhaustible if you simply farmed it correctly and added enough water. It's not very satisfying because there's no grand ideological statement behind it. But
Right. So if I can ask a follow-up.
please,
So
maybe it's something
maybe
this.
open up. So the land to be opened up,
Yeah.
were the land considered as unborn?
Yes,
Okay.
that's precisely.
Thank you.
Very sad. Yes.
Yeah, can I follow up on Sydney's, first his remark, wonderful presentation, but also the question of productivity on the land.
Yeah.
Were there efforts to, on the basis of Chinese experience, were there efforts to increase production of the land?
To some degree, yes. The late Qing government issued manuals at times meant to increase productivity, but they were mainly concerned about silk production. You have to remember that for the late Qing rulers of Xinjiang, agriculture was a moral enterprise. It's very Jeffersonian in a sense. If you went and you farmed, if you got married and formed a family, you'd become a good person and the land would naturally become more productive. They actually paid very little attention to trying to make it more productive, which is part of the reason we see so many disasters later on. Or you see so many people starving because they hadn't really prepared for that eventuality.
Well, there are an awful lot of manuals that circulate during this period that talk about increasing productivity, but you're saying that they really didn't put them into practice. They were just almost theoretical statements about the value of agriculture.
I haven't seen any of those manuals put into practice here, which is surprising because I've seen plenty of manuals about morality and the law. One about silk production, because Bo Zongtang thought we could turn Xinjiang into a major silk producing center. But I've never seen a manual distributed about increasing agricultural production, which now I think is really weird, given that that was one of Bo Zongtang's major interests.
That's fascinating. Well, as a follow-up, if I may, also the question of these, these charitable organizations, the long tradition in Islamic culture for these, not just in Asia, but all over the place. So I was just kind of wondering how they mapped onto, they're religious in their orientation and they're serving the poor and so forth. China has its own lineage-based ones that are not based on religion, at least, an overarching religion. But I wonder, is there any interaction between those two kinds of charitable structures?
So one of the weird things about this period is also that when the Xiangmar came to Xinjiang, they acted like they'd never seen Islam before. Which is weird because they'd just been in Shanxi and Gansu, they're from China, they know what Islam is, they've been writing about Islam, but they treated local practices as sui generis. They retranslated everything or transliterated it into Chinese, acting as though they could never quite fathom what people were up to. And so they looked at Waqf, well, mostly they didn't notice Waqf, okay? When they did notice it, they saw it as a curiosity, and they would write about it in ethnographic terms like, well, this is something like an ancestral shrine. In terms of its legal status, Waqf was largely hidden. We see it here in the catastrophes in some places, but in terms of like inheritance documents, I've seen several cases where the Chaghatay language documents will say, on my passing, I want to endow this pious endowment, now this waqf, blah, 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 here it goes. The Chinese document says, I am leaving this land to my sons. And so, for whatever reason, people exploited the sort of conceptual division between the Islamic and Chaghatay sort of sources and practices and the Chinese ones, in order sometimes to hide and sometimes reveal waqf in ways that were strategic. And we can't know why they made one choice or another at a given time. But the fact is, I think it's 1908 when I first see a Chinese official write about a tomb shrine, a mazar, as something which might be comprehensible in the Chinese context. Thank you. It's very weird, isn't it? Please.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I know you mentioned a little bit about the conservative faction, as well as like the debtors beating their creditors to death. I was wondering, was there any sort of like organized decision making or like planning or organizing by like the average, like I guess person being affected by these, like farmers who were forced to, undergo like sharecropping system? Were they mostly passive in their reactionary decision making, or did they ever organize? Was there ever evidence of them doing anything to try to change the system or anything? I'm just curious.
Excellent question. We have collective violence at times. There's one incident from the early 1890s in Turpan where a group of debtors set fire to a Chinese settlement, for example, which was mostly Tianjinese. So this did happen sometimes, but mostly these incidents were not widely reported upon at higher levels. As you well know, most conflicts around these things were supposed to be resolved at the sub-magisterial level, and so they don't really get into the archive necessarily. I have no evidence of a large-scale collective effort to fight against indebtedness. Now, what I do have are riots. What I do have are burning the Chinese town. What I do have are records from Yarkand and Kashgar about people chasing Hindu moneylenders through the streets or attacking the sarais where they live. There's an interesting incident in the British archives where they're running after a Hindu man shouting, "Do you eat beef? Do you eat beef?" Which is weird. So there's still a lot of enmity there. But it's weird. I've never really seen a major instance of collective action. What I have seen is collective action against, people from within the community who violate its boundaries. That was a big theme of Land of Strangers, is that a lot of the story of this period is actually of Muslims using the Qing system to punish their own people who act in a non-Muslim way. But I don't really see organizing against the Qing state or against the moneylenders. Yeah. So people keep asking me, do you see this? And I'm like, I don't. Yes, David.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I think I have like a kind of a crude question.
Okay.
These Tianjinese merchants, how are they making profit? Because it's a long journey.
Yeah.
It takes effort to reclaim and reclaim the land. The land cannot be so fertile that few years of harvest would give you like a land full of money.
Yeah.
And you have not been ecologically sustainable. So like these lands are useless after a while. So how are they making any profit?
It's a great question. I think they managed to indebt people who are working productive land as well. I think that we see this process play out in the most extreme way in these marginal cases where people are kicked off their land, right? That's one of the effects of it. I think that they do manage to collect cotton, tobacco, other things that are being grown there, perhaps opium, if you read David Bellow's work. It's a good question. Because again, we don't have the records from Tianjin. We don't have internal records apart from this one account book from from the Fushun Tai. We know that they collected debts. We know that they found it worthwhile to invest in this enterprise. We know they found it worthwhile to build warehouses and to transport people back and forth. I have a memoir from a man who traveled across China 4 times between Tianjin and Gucheng to participate in this trade. I don't know how much profit they actually made. And I'm not worried.
Keep going.
I now was worried that's the question I'll have to answer for the guys who write this book. But no, we don't have an answer on that. Oh, another non-answer. I apologize. Yes, please. Hi, Chang.
Yeah, first, thank you for the fascinating talk. I can have the question about Tianjin merchants as well.
Yeah.
Are they trying to do the same thing in the other regions, purchasing lands, like maybe they're getting profits from other places, or they are focusing on Xinjiang because their relationship with Xinjiang?
So in this case, they're focusing on Xinjiang because there's a special relationship. That's very, very clear. The Tianjin's merchants are weirdly not that active in other places. They have other depots in China proper where they're selling goods, picking them up, but this is the place where they appear to be buying up land. They're really focused on buying land around Karez, these underground irrigation channels in the region. That said, they're not alone in engaging in this kind of activity. Actually, Kwangmin Kim is working on this right now. In other border regions, Mongolia, Guangxi, Qinghai, places like this, Heilongjiang, other merchant groups are trying the same basic thing. So the Tianjins are not unique in this regard. But my story is really focused around Xinjiang because it's a way of telling the grassroots story. It's part of the fun of the project. It's actually finding comparisons between this area, the Northeast, Taiwan, and Qinghai, and finding that similar practices of measurements and making the land known, but also similar practices of enclosure and extraction were at work, despite the different environments.
Yeah.
Sure.
Do you still have time? Yeah, I still wanted to ask about property rights. So yeah, because in my research about Japanese colonialism in Hokkaido or in Brazil,
Yeah.
So the definition of unowned land has to be clarified by law, right? To what is a land that should be considered unowned, so that you can open up and claim it.
Yeah.
Right? In the Brazilian case, there are a lot of dispute about whether this land is unowned or not. I was wondering, have you ever encountered some of the kinds of dispute, right? Say, for example, local indigenous people, argue that this is not unowned, it's belong to myself, and the new, the Han settlers came and, claim them to be unowned, so that they can open up. So I was wondering, whether there were cases like this.
So the question of what is unowned land is a question of what is productive and yet unworked land. So the initial survey intended to establish the boundaries of what could be made productive. And in the initial cadastre, you see huge amounts of land, which I've actually left off the charts because they're so large, where the Qing state believed that this land could be workable if it were irrigated. So that's partly defined. And I should actually clarify that technically this isn't land ownership. According to the Qing government in this place in this period, no one owns the land. It shall be guandi, it shall belong to the officials, and one gains the right to exploit it by opening it up and then promising to pay taxes on it. So you don't receive a certificate of ownership, you get a zhizhao, right? You're holding a certificate that says you're allowed to work the land. And technically it's not even tax, it's rent. So that detail, I think, is important to keep in mind, how the land opening actually functioned. That's something that we often miss. As for disputes over who the land belongs to, yes. But it's usually not over whether or not the land is unused. It's over whether or not the land belongs to someone because of, so the king of Turpan, for example, complains that much of his land had been seized by the Hokkandis during the uprisings period, during the Xinjiang War. And thus, it had been miscategorized, and he wanted it brought back into registration as part of his own land. So he complained to the Qing administration about that for a very long time, for decades in fact, because he'd lost significant rights of his own. On the popular level, right after 1877, Han settlers begin to come back, and they begin to claim that land was rented to their uncle who was killed in the uprisings, and they would like to keep renting it, please. Or they claim that the land was seized from them by the Muslims, and they would like restitution of some kind. And interestingly, the Qing administration typically sides with the Muslims in these cases in order to maintain some kind of social stability and not lead to a flood of Han settlers coming and claiming land. What's more effective is bones. This is chapter 5 of Land of Strangers. I talk about this a bit. People used real or fictitious graves to claim land, suggesting that actually the body buried here, these bones are actually my grandfather's. They were here before the uprising. Someone says, actually, no, these are Hui bones. they belong to my Sino-Muslim uncle, this land is actually mine. Or actually, no, this belongs to someone else. And sometimes you get disputes where 5 different claims to one skeleton are being made. But this is also familiar from China proper, right? So that kind of claim to ownership through through ancestry, in effect, and physical evidence is being made. I've never seen anyone involved in a dispute over whether or not something was unused land. I guess there's one case, though, in the early surveys in Korla, where it turns out in the initial cadastral survey, a couple of villages had been underutilizing their land because so many of the members of their villages had been displaced. And so land had been incorrectly categorized as unused. And so they came back the next year and said, actually, our family members have come back. We'd like to claim more of this land, please. And they were given it. But that's the only instance I can think of in 10 years of looking at this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time that we wrap this up. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. And thank you for coming here. And let's, give another round of applause.